Guys, can everyone, if you're comfortable, please turn your videos on.
Hi Swati, hi
That'd be
Rahul.
really nice. So can you confirm if the audio is clear?
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, you're audible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rahul, so yeah. So this meeting is being recorded for everyone's information who's participating. So I hope that's fine with everyone. We'll just start with a brief introduction with of the project, and then you three can take it up. Um, so good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first event of the Judgements Rewriting Project. To introduce the project, it is an effort undertaken by the collectives at NLS to approach the question of law and policy through an intersectional perspective. This was inspired by the Feminist Judgments project published by the Indian Law Review in 2021. And we seek to call scholars who are experienced in taking diverse approaches to the law. For today's event, we have Arvind Narrain, Dr. Swati Shah, and Dr. Rahul Rao to talk to us about a queer approach to the law. Post this, we will be calling scholars including Rahul Bajaj to discuss a disability rights perspective and others to discuss a feminist and caste-based perspective. The goal of these sessions is to help the audience understand methods employed in taking these approaches to law and facilitate the employment of these methods in rewriting legal decisions if the audience wishes to do so. Before we begin, I would like to introduce the speakers. Arvind Narrain is the co-editor of Law Like Love, Queer Perspectives on Law, as well as the co-author of Breathing Life into the Constitution. He was part of the team of lawyers challenging Section 377 of the IPC from the High Court in 2009 to the Supreme Court in 2018. Dr. Swati Shah is an anthropologist who works on questions of sexuality, gender, migration, and caste capitalism in India. They're affiliated with the Asian American Studies program, and in the social thought and political economy of Out of Time, the Queer Politics of Postcoloniality, and Oxford University Press. He has research interests in international relations, postcolonial and queer theory, gender and sexuality, and South Asia. I would now invite the speakers to introduce the texts they will be discussing and the approaches they will be taking. So why don't you take it up?
Swati, do you want to begin? I'm just to.
Sorry, I had a little bit of an internet connection problem. In which order are we speaking?
We haven't decided an order, but you guys can start amongst yourselves, decide amongst yourselves how you wish to go.
Okay. So I will request not to present first, but I will just quickly say that the text that I'm going to be drawing from are the Aadhaar judgment, as well as the history of sexuality. But I will be referencing other pending cases, including the gay marriage case and the Special Marriage Act.
Rahul, do you want to begin?
I don't think I want to begin, but I can just say something briefly about what I was going to speak to. I was going to speak to one of the chapters in Out of Time, which you may have had access to. So this is a chapter that is, the book as a whole is about the politics of time in queer movements. And this chapter looks particularly at the temporality of some recent Indian legal judgments relating to the queer and trans movement, particularly the Nalsa judgment in juxtaposition with some of the 377 judgments. So it's broadly thinking about transness and the claim to backwardness as articulated by trans activists in that case, and how we might think the politics of gender identity and the politics of backwardness in relation to each other, both at the level of the queer and trans movement itself, but also at the level of the nation state itself. Probably add that although I went to National Law School many years ago, I am not a practicing lawyer, and I haven't really engaged with the everyday practice of the law for a long time. So I approach these questions more as a political theorist and a theorist of international relations who remains very interested in the life of the law and the struggles around it and provoked by it.
Fine. Okay. Okay. In which case, I mean, let me just take the. Since you guys have both kindly granted me the floor, I'll go ahead and just put forward what I have to say, and then we can follow from that. Thanks, Sarthak, for hosting this particular discussion, and as you put it, in terms of a queer judgment rewriting project. And if you want to go back a little bit and think about, what would a queer perspective on the law be? I'm sure there'll be many diverse opinions, both from Swati and from Rahul. And I was thinking that one way to think about it is the entire question of, what is the particularity of the queer experience when it comes to history? I'd say that one point might be the entire question of interpretation, right? You're interpreting at present maybe material which is very, very limited. We're talking about, again, in the historical sense. Of course, in the contemporary sense, you'll have lots of material, right, from the same-sex marriage case to the 377 case, etc. But in a historical context, to go backwards, you'll find that the material might be fairly limited. Even take a great example, right? I mean, Navtej is about the decriminalization of Section 377. If you look at 377 itself, look at the judicial record and look at the range of cases, which is High Court decisions till then, decisions of the courts, even prior to independence, you'll find actually that there's very little which is about the queer experience. In fact, in our search, right, we found 3 reported judgments, which are about, potentially about same-sex consenting couples, and 1 reported judgment about a transgender person, right? So the first problem you face is the question of silence. If there's a silence, then the question you come to is, how do you interpret that silence? What are the lens you have with which you interpret that particular silence? And here, I think I just want to reference the essay I sent you all guys, which is Ranjit Guha's essay, Chandra's Death, which actually absolutely brilliant essay, the way I read it, in terms of the question of, what he says, right? He says history. Again, this is a subaltern historian, right? He's saying history is normally about the big events. How do you trace the passage of a subaltern life through history? How do you place the lens of history on points which normally escape history, right? How do you, in a sense, excavate a life which might not really be there? And how do you make meaning of stories which might not be there in any direct sense? That's the question he's raising before you. And maybe just that story, just to place it before you and look at what he's done and say that's maybe one lens towards understanding, towards a queer perspective, and the inspiration one can draw from Guha's essay, Chandra's Death, right? If you've read the story is basically this widow Chandra gets pregnant in an extramarital relationship, and because she got pregnant, there's concerns in the family about what we do about this. So they decide to give her to get medicine which can cause an abortion. In the course of taking the medicine, the fetus is expelled, but also she dies in the entire process. And post that, there's a trial of the people closest to Chandra, which is sister-in-law and a mother, for the murder of Chandra and for the murder of Chandra, right? And Guha casts a lens, and again, it's a very interesting way he describes this. He says, you look at this within the judicial record, the sense you get is a trial for murder. You don't really get a sense of what are the other dynamics, other relationalities which are there. So the way he puts it very, very well. I can't quite quote it now, but he says the drama or the relationalities which are actually there, the social relationalities which are there, again are absorbed within the structure of the law to tell a completely different kind of a story, where family and relationship and kinship relationships are converted into relationships of murder. Right? So there's a way in which what is familiar becomes completely unfamiliar through the language of the law, or what is the social reality becomes completely unfamiliar through the language of the law. Right? And that's the point that he makes. And so his point is, how do we now reinterpret this fragment? Right? And one possible way of reinterpreting a fragment can be through your own imagination, right? And say that, there can be literary imagination which can reinterpret it. There could be a filmmaker's artistic imagination which could reinterpret it. There could be cultural imagination which would reinterpret it, right? And these are all points to keep in mind. But he goes through a historical lens and goes through the sense of the historical record of the moment in time to try and arrive at the question, what is it which must have impelled Chandra's closest relatives to try and get the fetus aborted? Why did they do that? Right? And the answer he finds, the answer he finds is that what he calls the law of the Samaj, right? That is the fact that caste panchayats at that moment in time had very, very strong norms in terms of what is acceptable sex or unacceptable sex, and strong penalties of the unacceptable sex. So if you're a woman who engaged in sex outside the relationship of marriage, then there is very strong strictures against you, to the extent that you would be placed in akhara, which is you'd be completely ostracized from society. It was a kind of what Ranjit Guha says, it's a place where all the lost souls of Hinduism were confined to, right? So you were confined, or you were sent to this purgatory for the lost souls of Hinduism. So the idea is, if you want to avoid being in that purgatory, the only way forward is the entire question of abortion, which is the reason that they go for this. Of course, then raises the question, of course, is why are these norms really there? How do we understand these norms? If these are the norms which in a sense strongly influence people's lives, what is law then? Is law finally the law of the state, or the law of the Samaj as important as law of the state? Again, you go back to Ambedkar, the point that he makes is, he says that if the organized part of a people can limit your rights, maybe that's a greater moment than the law of the state, right? And again, in the Balgopal's line, he says, in India, caste is the law, right? So there's another kind of a thinking which emerges from Chandra's death, which is the idea that, maybe we need to look outside the framework of state law itself to understand what are the forces which can limit your right to autonomy, dignity, expression, etc. Right? So, so the point, the other point I want to make actually about Chandra's death, the other point of the story, which is very, very important, is what again Ranjit Guha makes the point. The absent voice here is the voice of the man who got Chandra pregnant. Right? The only point he makes is that I had illicit intercourse with your daughter. He tells the mother that, I mean, in the form of the testimony, and now you either send her to bake to ostracism, or you abort the fetus. There are only two options, right? And as Ranjit Guha puts it, he says in the language of in this case the patriarch, right? There's none of the lover sentiment of intimacy. There's only this language of the patriarch, right? There's no way in which you get the sentiment of intimacy and love, anything on those lines, right? And so again, he's speculating. He's saying that, what is it which must have driven Chandra into this kind of relationship? Is it a loveless relationship in terms of the marriage that she had? Is it a kind of desire which could not be fulfilled within the framework of marriage? Is it the norms which say that you can't go outside that framework of marriage, whatever the consequences may be, right? So I think that's the point I'll make about the Chandra's death. That's one point I'll make. The other question which I want to make, the other point I want to make actually, the other point I want to make is actually I drew a little bit of it from, if you look at Rohit De's book, People's Constitution, and look at the chapter on the cow slaughter laws, on the challenging the uh, the, uh, the ban on cow slaughter in Bihar, right? And it's again, in terms of methodology, it's absolutely fascinating, because again, as lawyers and as law students, you know that, how you read a judgment is, you read a judgment in terms of what you have with you, right? The judgment is basically that one text, and sometimes the text may not be enough to tell you the entirety of what is actually going on, which is, in a sense, Ranjit Guha's work on Chandra's death, which also Rohit De's work in terms of the book People's Constitution. The story he tells you is this, right? He says, okay, fine, the person who challenged this, the people actually who challenged this particular law were, I think he documents over 1,000 people spread across 3 states who all belong to the Qureshi community. If you read the judgment, you won't get a sense of who are these 1,000 people, why did they choose to challenge this particular law. You won't get any sense at all. The only point you'll get from the judgment is the fact that, what is, for example, is the slaughter of cattle an essential practice of Islam. That's what the judges focus very strongly on, and they conclude that it's not. Therefore, the question that the cattle ban slaughter is valid in general, apart from one particular proviso, right? But the question he goes into is, why were these guys challenging this particular law? And the answer he comes to, and the members of the Qureshi community were a community who were involved in a range of occupations around the slaughter of cattle, right? Right from the use of the blood for making certain products, use of the hooves to making certain products, to using of bones to make certain products. So these were the people, right? And when the cattle slaughter ban came in, their big concern was the fact that, how are we going to carry on our trade or profession? That was the core concern that they had. And Rohit's point somewhere is there's a disjuncture between what the petitioner actually wants and the arguments the lawyers are making, right? And so again, that's an interesting point, saying that, from this perspective, you need to take your petitioner very seriously and understand what the petitioner is actually thinking of. This links me, actually, this Rohit's chapter on cow slaughter links me to one other book. I'll make this and end with this, which is the story of, in the United States, the story is Bowers versus Hardwick, right? Again, the question, who was Michael Hardwick, who challenged that particular law? There's a very interesting article by Kendall Thomas called Beyond the Privacy Principle, where he documents the story of how, for example, Michael Hardwick is drunk one day and is out on the streets, and then he lands up somehow, right, pursued by certain goons in his home, and a police officer after enters his room and arrests him, right? And so that's the story he tells you. So we get a different, and that story of Michael Hardwick is something you don't get if you read the reported judgment of Bowers versus Hardwick. Again, you read the reported judgment of Lawrence of Texas, you don't get the story who John Lawrence was, right? So maybe one point, the only point I'm making here is one part of your judgment rewriting project should take very seriously who the petitioner is, what are their life stories, what is it that they come with, and to what extent does what they come with and what they want find a reflection in the arguments of the lawyers and find in the judgment of the court. Yeah, let's just end with that.
Yeah, thanks for that, all of you. But before we proceed, we just had a question. How would you like to take up questions? Do you want questions to be reserved for the end, or do you
I think
want...
at the end it's better, no? Because we'd like to hear
Sure.
all three speakers. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks.
Rahul sir, would you want to go ahead with the idea that Arvind sir has presented about, the question that comes up is, how do we look into petitioner stories? How do we see a queer lens in the understanding of their stories exactly?
Yeah, thanks, Nidhi. So my internet connection is a little spotty, so if it goes off, just send me a message and hopefully we can reconnect. So I was going to think a little bit along the lines of, well, first of all, looking at some recent judgments and thinking about, I think the question of how we would rewrite judgments is a really interesting one, because it invites us to critique, it invites us to think about the problematics of judicial reasoning and how we might do something differently. In the particular chapter of Out of Time that I think was distributed, I'm interested in the temporalities of the Indian queer and trans movement, but more specifically in how the court apprehended or understood those temporalities. We don't often think about time and the politics of time, I think, in social movement activism. Or if we do, I think we assume that the point is to move forward. We assume a kind of progressive forward movement as a sign of improvement, of progress. This is what it means. But I think what we see in the Nalsa judgment is many different temporalities at play, both in the language of the petitioners themselves and in the reasoning of the judges. And so that's the question that I would like to direct our attention to. So as you probably know, the Nalsa decision broadly recognized the right of trans persons to self-identify as male, female, third gendered. These categories have been critiqued by a number of trans activists and scholars. The judgment also recognized the constitutional entitlements of dignity, equality, non-discrimination. And importantly, it ruled that trans persons should be recognized as a category of socially and educationally backward citizens, which is one of the demands of the trans petitioners and activists. And it's that third element of the decision that I'm most interested in. Now, we know, of course, that legislators have ignored this aspect of the judgment. So the implementation of the judgment, the ways in which it has been perverted in successive bills that have been introduced, is a separate question that I won't take up here. For now, I'm focusing on the judgment itself, and particularly on this designation of backwardness. Before I get into that, maybe it would be helpful to think a little bit about the analogy that is sought to be drawn here between gender identity, that is transness, and backwardness, which historically in India and in the Indian constitutional lexicon has been understood in terms of caste. So how do we equate or analogize gender identity with caste becomes a central analytical question. This analogy, at one level, we can understand is necessary because caste is the original basis on which the Constitution promises affirmative action. So subsequent social movements that want to avail of those provisions have to make caste-like analogies in order to avail of those protections. But it can also be problematic in the sense that when we analogize different categories to one another, we can sometimes problematically erase prior understandings of those terms. So there's a really interesting piece by Janet Jacobson, a US-based queer theorist, who draws attention to the problematics of analogy, where she says that when we make statements such as, and she's thinking about the American context here, queers are the new Jews or queers are the new Blacks, these kinds of statements can paradoxically assume both that the prior occupants of these categories of disadvantage, here Jews or Blacks, have moved on, and so their place can be taken by some new category. But it also paradoxically assumes that their status is relatively unchanged, familiar, and still abject, so that it can function as the stable ground of the analogy. And so paradoxically, we seem to be suggesting both that the prior occupants of disadvantage have moved on, but also that they have not moved on, that they are still in the same place, which is why they function well as an analogical category. It's also problematic to analogize because when we make analogies, we tend to imagine separate side-by-side categories, right? You compare this with that, and you assume that they're separate things. But in fact, the categories may be connected in all kinds of ways. So for one thing, the categories are intersectional. One has a gender identity and a caste. And one of the problems of the judgment was a failure of intersectional reading, a failure on the part of the judges to understand the caste complexity of the trans community and to think through what it would mean to recognize the community as a whole as backward, as opposed to a kind of horizontal reading of backwardness within the trans community. So intersectionality is one. The other is that the categories might be co-constitutive. They might make each other. So there's a really interesting and important early essay by Ambedkar where he's trying to define caste. And After going through many definitions, he concludes that caste cannot be defined without reference to gender. What he's doing in that essay is he's looking particularly at gender oppressive practices like the prohibition on widow remarriage, sati, infanticide, etc. And he argues that the rationale behind these practices is to maintain caste endogamy. And so he concludes the essay by suggesting that caste cannot be defined without reference to gender and vice versa. And this means that gender and caste are co-constitutive. Each is necessary to define the other. One does not exist prior to the other. One is not more fundamental than the other. They have a kind of co-equal status in defining each other. And we might also think of the categories as path dependent. That is, they have histories, and the history of one category might affect that of another. So a really interesting paper on this issue is a reading by Shamira Meghani of some quite recent films and the ways in which HIV discrimination is described in those films. And Meghani concludes that the metaphors and the idioms through which HIV discrimination was being discussed in those films draw very much on the language of untouchability and caste stigma. So in a sense, caste establishes the forms in which other forms of discrimination are expressed. And this suggests a kind of path dependence. So analogies can be necessary, they can be problematic, they can also be emancipatory. And this, of course, was the hope of the trans petitioners in that particular case. And emancipatory more specifically here because the trans appeal to backwardness has the potential, and I think has a demonstrated potential to import a kind of Ambedkarite politics into the politics of queerness and transness and gender more generally in India. So that emancipatory possibility is also something that I'm really interested in. Now, looking at the judgments themselves and going back to this question of temporality, I won't dwell on this too much, but my reading of the judgments is that if you look at the Naz Foundation judgment, for example, the court relies on many sources to come to its conclusions. It relies on Indian constitutional law primarily, but also on international human rights conventions and principles, on foreign case law, on what it calls the unanimous medical and psychiatric opinion that homosexuality is not a disease, on what it calls the moral and professional consensus among human rights and equality experts, and so forth. So broadly, I would say that the court took its cues from its sense of the directions in which the contemporary world was moving. In other words, the court was trying to read modernity, the direction of modernity in coming to its conclusions. In the Nalsa judgment, you see something quite different temporally. Of course, the court looks at the law, and of course, it looks at medical opinion, but it roots its legitimation of trans persons in what it calls their strong historical presence in our country, specifically in Hindu mythology and other religious texts. Now, this is one aspect of the judgment that trans activists and scholars like G. Iman Semala, for example, have been very critical of. So Semala reads this as an instance of what he calls Hindu homonationalism, because the court focuses on a putative golden Hindu era, neglects the presence of trans life in the so-called Muslim period of subcontinental history, and represents the colonial period as the beginning of trans oppression, in a sense romanticizing pre-colonial life as one of trans acceptance, and post-colonial life as the opposite. A different problem that other activists and scholars have pointed out is the conflation of trans with hijra, which historically is the most legible form of transness to a mainstream Indian public, right? So in a sense, the judgment upholds the dignity of what it largely reads as trans feminine persons. There's very little reference to trans masculine identities or forms of embodiment, primarily because of this historical genealogy mentioned in religious scriptures, etc. So in this judgment, you see a turn towards the past as a source of legitimation for the claims of the petitioners. Now, as I said, activists have pointed out many different kinds of problems here, the homogenization of transness, the various problems with analogy, the lack of recognition of intersectionality, and so forth. But I think a different kind of question is the question of legibility. Is gender identity like caste? How has a certain kind of gender identity come to be treated as like caste? And what are the implications of thinking about certain forms of gender identity in the language of backwardness? Now, at one level, the analogy was sustained by everyday life experience. So many Hijra and trans activists, particularly Dalit trans activists, have pointed out that there are many aspects of everyday life that can be analogized between the two communities. And of course, people at the intersection of these categories are best placed to tell us this. So, for example, if you read Living Smile Vidya's autobiography, where she talks about the occupational fixity, the categories of work that Hijras are forced to perform, or that trans people more generally are forced to perform, begging and sex work that can be analogized to the historically degraded forms of labor that Dalits, subjects, and citizens have been forced to perform, or the social ostracism to which both categories of people have been subject when it comes to things like housing, work, and so forth. But I think a different way of thinking about this analogy is through the categories of governmentality. So you will know that in the colonial census, Hijras were enumerated as one of many castes and tribes, particularly under the Criminal Tribes Act, where they were classified as a criminal caste. And after the denotification of these communities post-independence, subsequent legislations like the Habitual Offenders Acts continued to stigmatize and mark out Hijra and trans communities in this way, in this caste-like way. So there is, we might say, a genealogy of governmentality, of categories in which the state has apprehended the community as if it was a caste-like group. And I think it's that history, it's that genealogy that the Supreme Court is drawing on, of course, for emancipatory purposes, but it is those lenses that still enable the making of the analogy in the mind of the court. Now, I also try and devote some attention in the chapter to the very category of backwardness, the word itself. I'm really interested in the etymology of the word backwardness and how it came to be used by the framers of the Constitution. At one level, the term is very uncomfortable. In a temporal sense, it seems to connote primitiveness, a status of being left behind. And its connotations in that sense feel very different from the radical connotations of a term like Dalit, which has been appropriated and has come to stand for a certain kind of pride. It also very clearly, because it translates as broken or oppressed people, it points our attention towards the fact that backwardness is not a natural condition. It has been produced by someone else, by oppressor castes. So Dalit in that sense has a much more radical connotation than the term backward. And so the question for me was, why use the term backward? Why do the legislators and drafters of the Constitution use that term? And for this, I turned to Rochna Bajpayee's work on the drafting of the Constitution and the key categories that have underpinned some of the central shifts in understandings of group rights in Indian legal and constitutional history. The book is called Debating Difference. And she talks about the ways in which categories like this have been filtered through some of the major political priorities that legislators have felt at particular moments. And she argues that at the moment of the drafting of the Constitution, one of the fundamental values that animated or that was uppermost in the minds of the drafters of the Constitution was the imperative of national unity. Everything, she says, was filtered through this imperative. So in this moment, when the Constitution was being drafted, there was a great hostility towards special rights for minorities, things like separate electorates, for example, because these were the rights that were seen to have culminated in the separatist politics of partition, which, of course, the framers of the Constitution did not want to see repeated. So there's a great hostility to special rights for minorities, but a greater receptiveness to the possibility of affirmative action, or what we call reservation, for backward categories. And the reason that there was a greater willingness to countenance this was not just because of the leadership of Ambedkar, important as that was, and I'll come to Ambedkar's particular view here, but because of this feeling that that affirmative action for backward sections would enable backward sections to become like forward sections, that it would promote national unity, that it would promote assimilation into the nation rather than separation, right? Now, I'm thinking here particularly of the mindset of upper caste members of the Constituent Assembly agreeing to these provisions, rather than necessarily the understanding that Ambedkar himself had. That understanding, of course, was much more ambitious. It was much more radical. For Ambedkar to speak of backwardness was not to ensure that the backward became like the forward. Ambedkar's vision was much more radical than that. We know, for example, that he launched an uncompromising attack on Hinduism in Annihilation of Caste, and that he also wanted to lead his followers out of Hinduism, which he eventually did through the conversion to Buddhism. This itself was a neo-Buddhism that was refracted through the categories of Marxism, even though he also had a critique of Marxism. So what the Ambedkar was doing through these many complex political theological moves was to craft a new Dalit subject influenced by all of these, drawing from liberalism, Buddhism, and Marxism. In his vision, Dalits would not simply dissolve into a casteless society, but would be a new revolutionary subject, right? So in one sense, he's leading Dalits out of oppression under Hinduism into a new future, which would be influenced by these other ideological tendencies. But the interesting thing is that this is not purely a separatist move, because it's not as if he exits Hinduism and doesn't care about what Hindus do. Remember that as the first law minister of India, he's also deeply invested in reforming Hindu law, and deeply frustrated that his efforts to reform Hindu law have not yielded the results, the fruits that he hoped for, which is what accounts for his resignation. So what I think we see here is a politics that is neither assimilationist, he doesn't want Dalits to become like caste Hindus, nor is it separatist. He doesn't simply want to exit Hinduism and leave caste Hindu society as it was. It's a politics that cannot be expressed in terms of assimilation or separation. And this is what I think also makes Ambedkar very interesting and relevant to queer politics. Because in queer theory and queer politics, we see similar tensions between assimilationist tendencies that want queer and trans subjects to be like heteronormative subjects, to fit in, to assimilate, to become the same as. This is what we sometimes call homo-nationalism, what I've also called homo-capitalism, right? The effort to fit in. But we also see a contrary tendency, the radical tendency to separate. And at one level, that tendency towards separatism can look more radical, but perhaps sometimes it can also look more defeatist. It can look like a politics of resignation, that we could not transform society in the ways that we want to. So our only option is to step out of it, to create separate space in a sense, and to regroup in that separate space. And I think what we see with Ambedkar is a politics that is neither this nor that, but something else, for which we have to find a new language almost to describe what it is that he's trying to accomplish. What I then go on to do in the chapter is I try to read some recent Hijra and trans autobiographies and life narratives that show a similar tension between separation from mainstream society, but also re-engagement, a sharpening of identity, but also a dissolution of identity. Now, of course, here I try not to generalize across Hijra and trans life worlds. I try to show different tendencies, more conservative as well as more radical. But I think what we can see is a strain of trans politics in which there is a convergence with this Ambedkarite politics of futurity that I've been describing. And you know, the chapter goes into more detail about that convergence and how we can actually see it emerge. Then in the second half of the chapter, I try and shift to a different level where I'm thinking not just about the queer and trans movement, but the nation itself and imaginaries of the Indian nation state. And the ways in which gender identity and backwardness, forwardness are taught at the level of the nation state. I won't dwell on this too much, but we can maybe talk about it more in the Q&A. But here I'm thinking of discourses in which, anti-colonial discourses in which the nation is imagined as feminized, as colonized, oppressed, as feminized, in need of the protection of nationalist men and a kind of masculinized state. And I try and contrast that with discourses of rising India, this notion of India as a rising power, in which the nation state is masculinized, and how that transition in gender identity of the nation is also, in a sense, mapped onto being backward and becoming forward. So how are gender identity and backwardness, forwardness now related at the level of the nation state itself? I think that's a different sort of question, but it's one that interests me and preoccupies me a great deal as a scholar of international relations. So maybe I'll stop there, and perhaps we can come back to some of these questions in the discussion.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rahul sir. Swati ma'am, why don't you go next and discuss why you suggested Foucault's chapter on sexuality, the history of sexuality, and simultaneously the Aadhaar judgments. What is the connection you're trying to draw there, picking up from Rahul sir's presentation?
Sure. So thank you also for inviting me to be part of this event. I'm so happy to see so many people here at this late hour. Very gratified to see all this interest. Can I just, by either those of you who have your camera on or by emoji, how many of you had read History of Sexuality before? Okay, I'm seeing like 4 people. All right. So first, let me tell you why I asked you all to look at that text. One of the reasons I wanted to start with that is because I think when we are talking about a queer judgment rewriting project, we are, in a sense, talking about a practice of reading. If we are talking about a practice of reading, we have to have a method for that reading, right? We have to kind of understand what we're looking at, and we have to have a framework in order to process that information. I know this sounds very obvious, but it's going to get a little less obvious momentarily. One of the things that scholars of sexuality rely on is the Foucauldian concept of a discourse. A Foucauldian concept of a discourse is the idea that the way that we talk about things, the way that we legislate things, the way that we understand how things work in the world doesn't simply describe those things. It actually produces them in a certain way. It produces, for example, boundaries around social categories. Now, I'm interested in that because I'm interested in the ways in which categories around both sexuality and gender identity emerge. These are not categories that are stable historically. They are categories that have changed quite a lot, both historically and geographically. And in a sense, if we look at the colonial project in places like South Asia, part of that project was a project of disciplining local norms around gender and sexuality. You know, what was all this weird householding? What was all this gender fluidity? What was the deal with all these effeminate men in Bengal? All of these things have been written about by historians like Indrani Chatterjee and Mrinalini Sinha. There were different ways that people understood embodiment, sexuality, householding, and these questions are, in a sense, fundamentally tied to questions of capital and production and the economy. So one of the reasons that I offered both the Foucault piece as well as the Aadhaar judgment is to kind of suggest that if we're doing a queer rewriting of judgments, we of course should be looking at judgments that are specific to gender and sexuality related issues, because that's where these issues appear. That's where they are the most visible. But I think we also need to do this kind of reading for jurisprudence and juridical debates that are not necessarily apparently about gender and sexuality, but spaces in which questions of gender and sexuality are embedded. And Aadhaar is one of the places where there are certain, not just assumptions about gender and sexuality norms, but there is a reification, a reinstantiation of these norms. So the reason why Aadhaar is part of this discussion for me is because of the requirement to prove a relationship to an entity that's known as head of family within Aadhaar. In order to get an Aadhaar card, you have to provide a document that proves your relationship to something that's called the head of the family. And that's clearly in reference to a patriarch, to the male head of household. Now, what's interesting about that for me is the Aadhaar framework, among other things, was designed to try to reduce the size of the informal economy in India. The informal economy is the space of the economy in which the majority of people in India survive. It is a cash-based economy. It's where people are living hand to mouth. It's very local, and it's very hard to monetize by financial structures. It's hard for banks and corporations and the government to make money from the informal economy. So Aadhaar is a way to kind of expand the space of the so-called formal economy and expand the terrain in which profit can be derived from that space. And if you see some of the arguments that Nandan Nilekani and others made for Aadhaar early on, they refer to things like pulling people out of the shadows of the informal economy, out of the darkness and into the light. Now, in order to do that, they have to reify a certain form of embodiment as well as a certain form of the household, because all of the ways in which Indian citizens are being made legible to the state via Aadhaar includes very specific norms being instantiated around binary gender as well as sexuality. So that's a kind of overview of why I asked y'all to read those two things together. I'll just go through a few kind of quick points that I wanted to make in this regard, and then come back to this at the end of my remarks. So the first thing that I wanted to start with was the idea of method. And by that, what I meant was, I know you're all learning to be lawyers. You're going to be very practical in your working lives. You're going to do real things for real people in the real world. In this context, I would ask you to try to be impractical just for a moment. So what I'm saying does not necessarily equal action. What it is a way of thinking, a way of reading, a way of understanding. So in this mode of reading, we treat a document like the Aadhaar judgment or the Special Marriage Act as a text that is available to us to read exegetically. We can treat it as a piece of literature almost. We can look at its form. We can think about the way it uses certain terms and why it uses those terms. We can ask a lot of questions of the text that don't necessarily result in doing anything about it. We just try to pick it apart. You know, splitting hairs is a good thing in this method. And one of the things that Foucault teaches us in the way he splits hairs, in how he reads the history of the law in 18th century Europe, is he shows that the way that laws around sexuality are produced actually produce categories of sexuality themselves. So he has this kind of, the long passage that I offered you, that's kind of famous passage on what he calls a repressive hypothesis, is about the discourse of sexual repression among bourgeois people in Europe in the 70s, which is when he's alive. That's the we, in the we other Victorians. And he's basically saying, look, white bourgeois French elites are always talking about how repressed we are, but we're not actually repressed. This is a discourse of sexuality. We're not talking about sexuality when we say we are repressed. The question is not, as he famously says, the question is not why are we repressed? The question is, why do we constantly say we are repressed? How can we understand this discourse, this discussion about the repression of sexuality as a discussion about sexuality? And he talks about many such instances, particularly in 18th century Europe, in the zones of science, as well as the zones of the law, as well as the zones of canonical law, of Catholic law. So for him, an important site for the production, if you will, of sexuality is the church confessional. That space that's sort of seen to be the most conservative, the least sexuality related space imaginable, is actually the space that produces a discourse about sexuality. You're supposed to confess your sins. And there are a list of sins, including sins that relate to marital comportment. You have to confess impure thoughts. You're basically sitting there talking about sex. This is not, until Foucault's History of Sexuality happens, we did not really think of this as a space that produces sexuality. And here the idea of the analogy, also in reference to what Rahul was talking about, becomes important. A lot of critical theory uses analogies from industry, so production. You see a lot of stuff about production. It uses analogies from physics. Foucault loves analogies from kind of electrical analogies. He talks a lot about switch points. And it's important to kind of keep those in mind, because there is a kind of mechanics to some of the ways that social theory gets expressed that is interesting, but also is itself open to critique. And people like Deleuze and others came along and definitely critiqued the kind of clunkiness of some of these analogies and suggested other ways of thinking about the way social processes happen, like, for example, the analogy of an intensity, of an affective intensity. Anyway, when people using a Foucauldian paradigm talk about the production of things like sexuality and gender, we are not saying that these things are manifested out of thin air. So we're not saying that there's no physical world that we live in, that I'm not sitting on a chair, that I'm not breathing air, that I don't have a chemical process going on in my body. What we are saying is that there are certain categories, like categories of sexuality, gender, race, caste, class, that have histories. These are not permanent physical categories. These are ways of assembling phenotypic attributes of human beings into different categories. So gender, for example, is a category that emerges over time, and that probably binary gender emerges in relation to capitalist production. Capitalist production requires social reproduction. It requires binary gender to function. And one can say this with some confidence, because from an anthropological perspective, there's many communities around the world that don't operate through binary gender. There are spaces where people have the concept of 6 genders or no concept of gender. They don't see the world through gender. That doesn't mean that people don't have bodies. It doesn't mean that people don't have genitals. What it means is there is a history to the assignation of sex. right? A child is born and the first thing everybody does is look at its genitalia and say, it's a whatever, it's a girl, it's a boy, we can't classify these genitals, so this is an intersex child. Like, in some ways, that moment of looking and naming is not about kind of looking at something that's internal to the body. That is a moment of assignation. That is a social moment. It's not necessarily a biological moment. Now, why is this relevant for you all? Even if this sounds sort of very esoteric and very, kind of out there, one of the reasons that this is relevant for all of you is because the law has always been an important site for the instantiation and the articulation of these kinds of categories. There are always exceptions to the way these categories function. There's always leakage. There are always people who don't fit. But methodologically, this way of reading is a way of reading how discourses like a discourse of biomedicine or a discourse of the law produce the norms within the social world that we have to live in. What's interesting from a queer perspective is people are always breaking these rules. There's always leakage. The social categories are not fixed. There are always people who are outside of them. And how that's produced and what happens when that happens is very, very consequential and very interesting. So that's a method part. That's why I offered you all the Foucault reading. In terms of the queer part, I think it's important for us to note that when queer was first suggested as a term that could be reclaimed by the queer movement and queer activists, and Arvind has written a book about this also that I believe is called Queer. Queer was meant to identify an area outside of gay and lesbian identity. It was meant to be a space, a discursive space that was more open, that was more fluid, that allowed for people to have different object choices throughout their lives, as well as to not necessarily want to identify with a kind of normative bourgeois gay existence. Everybody who doesn't want to participate in heterosexuality doesn't necessarily want to have a spouse and own property and work in the formal economy. People have all kinds of ways that they might want to live out their life course. So queer was supposed to be this way of accommodating different kinds of households, different kinds of gender expressions, different ways of thinking about sexuality or not thinking about sexuality. If I think about queer as something that's discursively at least a little more fluid than gay, then I would make a distinction between having a gay reading of a judgment and having a queer reading of a judgment, right? Especially at this moment in time when through decisions like Navbij, as well as this to be perhaps decision on gay marriage, there does seem to be a kind of bourgeois normative gay existence that's being codified in the law. What does that say about the kind of revolutionary potential that is that Rahul is talking about in his work, or that the term queer was supposed to offer us, for not just kind of trying to include ourselves in an existing framework of normative coupledom, but to kind of really rethink the ways in which society is organized around that particular trope and that form of social reproduction. So if I think about this in relation to both Aadhaar as well as the impending potential judgment on gay marriage, I think about a few things. I think about primarily the concept of administrative legibility and why the kind of frame of a normative household, a patriarchal head of household, why these things are still being required if we're actually having a vision of society in which one can truly be queer. Within that vision of society, we have to consider the importance of economic agency and economic autonomy that is structured through administrative legibility. The way that the gay marriage argument is being made at the moment implies a person whose family is supporting everything that they do. A lot of times when people come out as queer or they come out as gender non-binary or as trans, the first thing that we encounter is a lack of support from our families, a kind of a rejection that may be economic, and that certainly is administrative, right? You know, it's difficult to access documents, it's difficult to have co-signing on loans and things of that nature. A person who doesn't have a relationship with their family and is trying to get an Aadhaar card will have a very hard time because they won't have access to the appropriate documents. Even people, like I know of a case of a cis man who's is with his mother. They left an abusive household and couldn't get an Aadhaar card. Is essentially disenfranchised because they don't have access to his father's documents. So I think a queer reading of something like the Aadhaar judgment would really be paying attention to questions of administrative legibility. A queer reading of something like the Special Marriage Act would also account for the fact that if you make gay marriage legal, but you keep the Special Marriage Act in place, you are essentially creating a charm circle, to use Gail Rubin's term, a very narrow space in which people can access gay marriage. You're not really kind of expanding the terms and the bounds of gay marriage. And so I'll end with the point that no judgment, no law exists in isolation. They all exist within a discursive ecosystem. And I think part of what a queer reading would do for us is to kind of account for the ways in which these various moments of legal discourse encounter one another and interact with one another, and literally what kinds of social norms they produce and reproduce and reify. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Professor. Would any of you like to go ahead again, or should we open up the floor to questions? Arvind sir, Rahul sir.
I think you can open it. I think you can open it.
Sure. If anyone has questions, could you please raise your hands? We'll wait for 2 minutes for you all to raise your hands.
Sarthak, may I go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Everyone just keep raising if you have questions meanwhile.
Yeah, this question is particularly for Professor Swati. So while you were mentioning about how to look at queer perspectives and how they might not just work in isolation in particular legislations and judgments, so the question that we are trying to deal with here is how do we locate that within a judgment itself? So for example, even when we are looking at Navtej, how do we look at it again through a queer perspective that is not very isolated in general, because there are a lot of criticisms against Navtej that it hasn't taken into consideration the caste perspective and the other perspectives that could actually come in. So how do we ensure that the judgments that we are rewriting adopts a form of intersectional perspective while at the same time not going against, let's say, what the queer perspective has been adopted in that period of time?
So without speaking to the specificity of your question, specifically how to rewrite Navtej in a way that's intersectional, I would say that there are many different forms of administrative legibility that judgments like Navtej foreclose. That this is actually something that we see over and over again in jurisprudence that is meant to be expansive, but ends up being much narrower, much more disciplined, much more focused in the rights and the kind of the ways that it expands rights than we would have hoped. So I think it's really about carefully looking at the places in which the judgment itself serves to narrow the field of things like privacy, for example, wherein privacy is being defined in the terms of, in very bourgeois terms, even though the movement that made Navtej happen was very particular about not wanting to do that, right? About wanting to have a much more expansive idea of privacy, as well as of the application of Article 21. And in Navtej, we see that expansive notion of privacy as in bodily autonomy, and not privacy within the four walls of one's home, which implies that you have a home and you have property and so forth, that those are spaces in which Navtej really falls below the mark. So I would say that there are lots of examples within judgments like Navtej where something that should have expanded rights actually delimits them, actually takes them away. And I think it's important to read Navtej alongside this judgments like Adar, which happened very soon after Navtej. There was a larger discourse happening about privacy that I think also facilitates this kind of anti-intersectional perspective that we see in both of these cases. I hope that answered your question.
I'll just add one small point to Swati's comment to help you even with the Navtej question of how you'd analyze it. Just one small addition I'll put forward is also maybe the question of reading Adar, which comes after, and reading Puttaswamy, which comes before. And Puttaswamy in particular, there's a section which Justice Chandrachud has, which is responding to the feminist critique on privacy. So I think that might be useful to contextualize that as well in terms of the way you understand, right, Navtej. And the point which Justice Chandrachud makes is that privacy, in an older understanding, was about the question of zonal privacy, but Puttaswamy takes it to relational privacy and decisional privacy. But the question still remains, is that an adequate response? That's the question which you can try and answer.
Thank you so much, professors.
Suvansh, would you like to go next?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yep.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for this session. And my question is specifically for Professor Rahul, but it goes across or cuts across what all three professors have spoken. So, Professor Rahul, one of the one of the points that you said caught my attention, which was essentially about how Dalit and queer politics, the one point of similarity among others is about how it cannot be expressed in either as assimilative or separatist, and how we might or we definitely need other forms of discourse or other a new language to express the same. What I was wondering, however, was given that how Professor Swati explained the evolution of categories and how law expresses categories or law is expressed in terms of categories. And also on what Professor Arvind spoke about how the petitioner's perspective is important. So what I was wondering was, given that we need to ground this in this perspective of judgment rewriting, and given that that a judgment it goes beyond just social discourse, but we have to ground that social discourse in how we are dealing with a given law. And given that laws tend to deal in categories, and laws tend to deal and in the ways in which demands for rights and demands for assertiveness need to be expressed in terms of law for the court to even take them up. How do you think we can deal with that? And what is the capacity for the expression of alternatives other than assimilation and separatism within the broader discourse of law and legal reasoning?
Thanks, Subhansh, for that question. I'll try and answer it also in relation to the previous question, if I may, because I think they're quite connected. As I understand it, you're sort of drawing our attention to the way in which the law requires categories in order to function, and
Yes.
the very articulation of those categories and their definition can and almost always do have disenfranchising effects. And I think that is a profound insight into the operation of the law, which in some sense also alerts us to the tragedies of legal reasoning. And I'm using tragedy in the sense of an inescapable problem, so to speak. So the previous question was, how do we think about what does a queer reading of a judgment look like? And for me, extending some of what Swati was saying, if we think about queerness, not just in terms of gender and sexuality, as categories like gay and lesbian do, perhaps, if we think of it instead as something broader, the very study or understanding of deviance from the normative, then what we're doing in queer readings of judgments is we're looking at who is left out, or what is the cost of a particular legal victory, quote unquote. And a different way of articulating that is what is outside the category, who is outside of these definitions. Even if the categories themselves are changing and evolving, even if a so-called progressive judgment delivers a new norm, it is important to recognize that what is happening is the instantiation of a new norm, a new way of being normal, of being normative, and that there is always something outside of that. And for me, the queer studies is about looking for that outside, the constitutive outside, if you like, because that is what now defines the new normal, the new kinds of inclusion that we're seeing in these so-called progressive judgments. Let me also give you an example from the process of litigation itself, which, although I was not part of, I was watching quite closely. So somewhere in the middle of the 377 litigation, a lawyer friend of mine who was associated with the case and who was collecting affidavits from queer people reached out to me and a number of other people. And the instruction to us, very interestingly, was write the affidavit as if you were addressing your conservative uncle. And I thought that was really interesting because what we were being asked to do, and I fully understood the reason for that sort of instruction. It was strategic, it was smart, it was tactical, it was intended to win a certain kind of result in court. But so there's a double-edged, nature in these moments. On the one hand, we are asked to assume a kind of subjectivity, to clothe ourselves in ways that will make us legible in the space of the law, that will make us not just legible, but also accepted. And the wager or the gamble is that, look, these are things we're just doing to get certain things, right? It doesn't mean that we become those things. But the risk, I think, always is that those tactical subjectivities end up creating new subjects. They end up reconstituting us and everyone else who wants to claim those rights and entitlements. That the tactics can end up becoming the end point, in a sense. That's the fraughtness, I think, of this process of engaging with using the law, which is something we cannot not do, but also carries these risks that I think critical theory is constantly trying to draw our attention to warn us about. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much.
Can I add something to that? I couldn't agree more. I think your question also, in terms of this, what are the options? It's either assimilate or withdraw. I think there is another way, which is to kind of really follow in the footsteps of the tradition of radical lawyering, of which there is a great tradition in India and elsewhere. But I think, as Rahul says, one of the things that distinguishes that tradition is its deep awareness that legal strategies and goals are themselves tactics. They are not necessarily endpoints. There's still a whole other layer of things to talk about with respect to implementation, as well as things that don't necessarily conform to a juridical process per se, which is again what people working in critical theory and in other movements are trying to talk about. So in my opinion, the best radical lawyering I've seen is really when people are, kind of part of a larger movement, and in which the legal strategies are strategies within a larger set of agendas and critiques.
Thank you, Professor. Apurva, would you like to go next, or Prajwal, did you have a question? Your hand was raised.
Yeah, Apurva can go ahead right now.
Okay, thanks. Apurva.
Yeah. Firstly, thank you for the talk, professors. I had a specific question to Professor Swati about reading discourse in a judgment. And it's a slightly an oddly specific question, which is that when you're reading discourse in a judgment, you can rely both on the speech of the judgment and the silences in the judgment. When you rely on silence as a space for understanding discourse, how do you sort of have safeguards, and how do you methodologically approach reading that silence?
That's a great question. Arvind used the phrase "a question of silence." That's also a book, which is called "A Question of Silence," published in 1998, which should be on all of your radar. I think it's a classic of Indian feminist sexuality studies, which talks a lot about the way silence structures the history of sexuality in India. I think when we have terms that we use to talk about silence in things like discourse analysis. So we talk about erasure, we talk about imbrications, we talk about elisions. There are a lot of ways that we talk about gaps in discourses that are themselves productive. Probably methodologically, the way that we talk most about silence is we talk about certain assumptions that are made, certain things that are taken to be quote unquote a priori, that are not necessarily fleshed out. I think that the idea that every person who applies for an Aadhaar card has to be made legible to the state via a patriarchal head of household elides a lot of other ways that households are formed, whether intentionally or by circumstance. The millions of female-headed households in India. What about them? What about people who grow up in such an environment? I'll just tell an anecdote from my youth. I remember staying with some friends of relatives in Bombay, and I was very jet lagged, and the lady of the house said, everything's fine, there's no one home. And there was somebody cooking in the kitchen, there were 2 children, there was several adults, and I couldn't understand what she meant by "there's no one home." But what she meant was her husband was abroad. So "there's no one home" means the person who matters, the only actual person in this household who is not a servant, who's not a child, who's not me, is not here. And I think that's a kind of elision that we see in a lot of jurisprudence that actually reifies very normative ideas about gender and sexuality, that we can use terms like this to elaborate.
Maybe I'll just add one point to that. How do you read the silence of the question that you ask? And perhaps one way, which is the Ranjit Guha kind of a point, is you read the silence through the good understanding of the history or the context of that particular moment in time, right? So in that particular fragment, in that particular judgment, there's no reference to the norms of society, the norms of the samaj, which limits sexual expression. He reads that as a reason why this entire question of the abortion was performed as far as Chandra was concerned, right? So that's one. Historical literature might be one source you can go to, and where you go a little beyond the text of the law and say, you ask a question, why did she go for an abortion? That's not answered in the text itself. To answer that question, maybe you go to in this case, archival and historical sources. The other way of doing it, since it's a judgment rewriting project, I'd imagine you can be a little more imaginative. So you could potentially go to literature, you could potentially go to culture, you could potentially think very creatively of how you interpret that particular silence and make it clear. This is in the context of a silence, your resort is to literature, try and understand that particular silence.
Can I just quickly jump in here? Because I think this question of silence is really interesting. Since we've discussed Guha, it might be interesting for people to also maybe read Spivak's critique of the Subaltern Studies project, which was coming at this question from a slightly different vantage point. And her critique was that while the Subaltern Studies project and its intention of filling in the gaps, so to speak, in the hegemonic historical record is a politically progressive one, there is always the danger of projecting onto those gaps and absences and silences our preoccupations as intellectuals, as whoever we are, of projecting categories from the present onto the past, of projecting elite preoccupations onto subalterns, etc., etc. So, I mean, and she makes this argument in a piece called Can the Subaltern Speak, which has often been misinterpreted as the subaltern cannot speak. What she's really getting at is not so much, and she says in subsequent interviews, she says, I never said the subaltern could not talk. I said, I wondered whether the subaltern could speak, and speech for her is an intersubjective thing. To speak, you also have to be understood. So when I teach that piece, I often rephrase the question as, can the bourgeois theorist hear? And really, this is the challenge for the reader, right? Especially the reader across gaps of time or class or caste or whatever other gaps we encounter in our readings, is whether those voices are legible to us, and to examine the structures that might impede that legibility. What is standing between the silence and us? What is preventing us from hearing? What is preventing us from understanding? Sometimes that needs to be worked on quite a lot before we can even begin to, hope to empathize or understand or reach for the speech that is there.
Thank you, Professor.
And I'll just quickly add a small point to what Rahul just said. In that essay, one of the reasons that it's often misunderstood, along with this, unfortunate naming, in my view, it should have been called Can the Bourgeois Intellectual Hear, as you say, is it's really about the subject. It's about the idea of subjectivity, and there is a kind of a whole intellectual tradition behind the subject, which is very worth diving into. But when we talk about silences, a lot of times what we are talking about, particularly in a juridical context, is what kind of subjectivity is being produced, and therefore what kinds of subjectivities are being foreclosed. And I think the concept of foreclosure is also a useful one when we're trying to take apart this notion of silence and how to identify it and how to work with it discursively.
Prajwal.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for the great lecture. My question was for Professor Rao, and it is more on the methodology of what we are trying to do. One concern that I had was with respect to how we use scholars and theories. Because a lot of times what I personally have seen is that we tend to study a lot of Western literature with respect to queer theory. So my question is much more with respect to how do we, in a sense, is that not tantamount to, you know, a sort of universalizing the experiences out of which the Western theories are born? Because if we are looking here in India to study, you know, queerness, are we, by employing such tools, in a sense, foregoing an opportunity to create a much more radical project of understanding queerness? And this question mostly comes from that observation that you made while you were speaking about how there is a general tendency to, you know, conflate the terms, conflate the categories of trans person and hijra. But the question I want to ask here is, do we need to, you know, in a sense, a comparative, contrastive study of these terms, is it even required? Because one is a part of categorization, how the Western theoretical categories are formed. One is, again, something quite close back home. So how do we, you know, how do we tackle this? How do we use scholars? How do we use theories while at the same time being true to the social circumstances we are in?
Thanks. That's a really important question. I think you're absolutely right about the intellectual genealogy of queer theory. It begins in Anglo-American humanities departments as a field of study, and even though it sets its sights on, even though a critique of universalism is very central to it, there is an ironic tendency for which it's perhaps not responsible, but the take-up of queer theory has universalized it, perhaps in problematic ways. But I think that if we understand queer not as relating to identity, but as the study of the non-normative, then I think there are ways of reading queerness in many different places and times that do not necessarily rely on those texts or those genealogies. For example, if we're interested in the history of non-binary gender, you don't have to start with Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. You can start with histories of gender in any part of the world, particularly pre-colonial histories and anthropologies of gender that are articulating or helping us understand the ways in which gender has been understood in other times and places. And you might find a convergence of insights, but we don't necessarily have to arrive at those conclusions through the same intellectual journeys, right? And some of these texts have been written before Gender Trouble, but perhaps weren't taken up in the way that Judith Butler was, and haven't attained that kind of hegemony because of the structures of the academy as well, right? And there we have to think about the structures of knowledge production, who gets published, who gets disseminated, what those avenues of publication and dissemination are, who gets read, how the language in which you write often determines who gets read and who is intelligible. And I think, so some of the most interesting work in, what's loosely being called the decolonization project in the academy is about writing new intellectual genealogies, showing us the knowledge that was always already there, but that was perhaps not recognized as such. And we can find this in all kinds of places. It doesn't even have to be in registers of academic writing. It can be in poetry, it can be in literature, it can be in oral history, it can be in indigenous knowledges of various kinds. I think these are really exciting possibilities, and those are the directions in which I think we have to go if we are to undermine the sort of false universalism of a lot of social and political theory today.
Thank you, Professor. If Suvansh, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. So sorry, I'm asking the question again, but Professor Rao mentioned, so you were talking about the legibility and the language utilized by certain groups. And I mean, it was not related to what I was thinking, but it led me thinking about the particularities of language and understanding or rather the deviance from the quote unquote normal understanding and language that queer people use alongside the language that the Dalit Bahujans and the Adivasis use in understanding the world. So my question was that how do we, while rewriting the project, given that we might not ourselves hold the identity being talked about, or rather, how do we sensitize ourselves, let's say, to utilizing language or understanding or incorporating the language or the forms of communication which are very specific to, let's say, queer people or Dalit Bahujan and Adivasi people? Because so just as an example, it's not particularly for queer people, but I was reminded of how the Adivasi idea of property and ownership is drastically different from the quote unquote normal liberal idea of private ownership, of communal ownership, and of ownership held together. So that was just an example. But how do we sensitize ourselves, and how do we incorporate that in the judgment rewriting? That is the specific language and forms of communication utilized by, let's say, queer people.
I think I have two answers to that question, and they're very broad answers because it's a big question. Sometimes I wonder if the problem is understanding and intelligibility. And if that's the case, then there is no substitute for learning languages, both literally and metaphorically. Learning other languages, learning other registers in which life happens, and that requires a willingness to engage in the politics of translation. It requires collaboration with people who are immersed in those life worlds. This is not work that can be done by individual scholars or activists working alone. So I think translation and collaboration are really central to acquiring that literacy, to understanding the things we don't understand. That may seem obvious, but I think there are other moments where I don't think the problem is intelligibility. There are other contexts in which I think we know fully well how the other thinks and operates, but there is a political unwillingness, a political unwillingness to give up power. And there it becomes a question of struggle. It becomes really a fight about who is going to give up what in order to redistribute what is at stake in that particular context. So yes, problems of intelligibility are very central, but sometimes I think even when things are intelligible, there is a problem of power and the radically unequal distribution of power and the unwillingness of those who have to give up even though they understand what is to be done. And there are many contexts in which we understand what is to be done, but still don't do it. Right? So that's what I'm gesturing at when I say the problem is not always an epistemic one of understanding, not understanding.
Can I add a small point to that? Just two things quickly. With respect to the earlier question about a lot of queer theory itself coming from the West, and how do we undo that? I think there's a big discussion about citational practices that is being generated through this decolonial turn that's happening in the academy. And the thing I would remark is, I think we are very fortunate, those of us who are engaged with Indian scholarship, to have a lot of resources at our disposal from work that's been produced here for a long time. And I would say that, yes, queer theory has a certain origin that is not South Asian, but the level to which questions of gender by people who are academics, scholars who come from Indian women's movements is really important to consider in the context of what's going on in queer studies here, both with respect to questions of sexuality, as well as with respect to questions of gender identity. I think that in some way relates to the previous question, in that I think that discursively speaking, when we are using this particular kind of legal framework, we are hindered by some of the origins of that framework. The juridical framework that exists in India is a liberal framework. The framework itself has a particular Western European origin, and that framework does reify individual subjectivity. It is very difficult within this legal context to talk about collectives, to talk about collective ownership or collective harm. Nevertheless, those tools are there. There is such a thing as equal protection. There is such a thing as a class action. There is a very creative use of the PIL. And I think that when I think about the tradition of radical lawyering in India, I'm also thinking about creative uses of ways to bring more collectivized claims rather than to reify individual harms.
Kind of related thought is how would you in some ways pluralize the ideas of law which you're dealing with in your project? Again, if you think of the question of sexuality, the regulation might be as much by non-state law as by state law. So the other ways in which you can engage with the realm of non-state law and what's happening. For example, the range of cases we know of two women in a relationship in an Adivasi village who were paraded naked, right? And that's a core form of violation, and it's something which is not reading. We're talking about reading a silence, right? It's something which is not emerged in any legal discourse. So I think that might be worth thinking of those kinds of instances and seeing how you can potentially shed light on one. The second is in terms of the by and large, if you say queer judgment rewriting project, will end up focusing on judgments of the High Court and the Supreme Court. So again, right, other ways you can go beyond the judgments of the High Court and the Supreme Court are the trial court judgments, which might be of great interest in this entire context. Point one. Are the courts or other tribunals, right? Could it be the disciplinary proceedings of the Bar Council, right? I mean, could there be some issues which come up in that particular context? Or could there be the under the Army Act or the military tribunals? Are there cases on the military tribunals, again, particularly cases we know very little about, which we might be worth shedding some light upon? And even within the High Court and the Supreme Court, give you one example. We talked about property, right? There's one case which Mayur Suresh actually discusses, which is a case of, I think, case of Kamla Jan. The case was the question of inheritance of the property of a hijra. Does it go according to the rules of inheritance as per Hindu law, or does it go vis-a-vis the custom which the hijra community has been following for time immemorial? The court in that case holds that goes vis-a-vis the custom of the which the hijra community has been following. Again, that case was found, right? Because he looked for it. I'm saying if you look with that eye on all the cases which are there, even High Court and Supreme Court, you'll find cases nobody's looked at because you're the first guys looking for that. So I think there's a world out there which we don't know about. So if you can find those cases and bring it again, bring it into this to our attention, that itself will be quite a fantastic effort.
Thank you, professors. I had a question myself. So my question is, if we borrowed from the Feminist Judgments project, and if you look at the judgments they've rewritten there, all of them were judgments that dealt with issues that were specific to women. So they had applied a feminist perspective there. But if we are to start this project and if we are to look up judgments, how do we pick judgments that we want to rewrite? So if, say, the court is deciding on an issue of abortion and it's recognized it only as a women specific issue, do we apply a queer lens there? Or if, say, there's a judgment where a court is denying protection to queer runaway couples and we say that no, the court's decision is wrong, so do we pick judgments that have dealt only with queer issues of queer individuals, or do we pick judgments or general judgments about general issues and apply a queer lens there? And if you are to do the latter, how do you begin that process?
I think Swati in some ways answered that question, right?
Yeah.
About judgment.
Yeah. Go ahead, Arvind. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think what your question demands is a discourse analysis first. Like, in order to decide which judgments to rewrite, you have to analyze the judgments themselves discursively. So you have to ask yourself, what judgments do I think are relevant to living to a livable life from a queer perspective? I think that's broadly what the law is supposed to do. What the law, and specifically the thing I've been focusing on in my remarks this evening, how does administrative legibility allow people to have a livable life? Why do you have to conform to certain social norms? Or why do you have to be a bourgeois person in order to have a livable life if you are not conforming to those norms? If you ask the question in this way, then I think that one has to ask questions like, what happens to people who are not administratively legible because they don't conform to binary gender, for example? There's been a lot of criticism from trans activists about not wanting to identify with a T or an M or a F. What is it about these judgments that's actually reproducing binary gendered norms that are preventing people from having a livable life? Maybe a queer rewriting of some of these judgments would actually be to eliminate gender identification, to not participate in that kind of governmentality and that kind of biopolitical regulation. That's also an option, is sometimes to kind of remove an aspect of power from the government in that way. But I think fundamentally what your question suggests is that the first step in even deciding what judgments to take on would be to kind of figure out what is a discourse of that judgment in the first place.
Thank you, Professor. Nidhi, your hand was up as well. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I think Professor Swati has answered it in part, but the question was basically very specific to how the Feminist Judgment Project went about writing these judgments again. So they had only focused on the material that was present in that specific moment. For example, when they took over Rukmabai, they only focused on the feminist literature that was present in 1886, rather than looking at it through a perspective that is present now. So as we were discussing earlier, how do we blind ourselves to the perspective that are present now? How do we blind ourselves to the constitution that has the way constitution has evolved and how we look at it? Because the kind of literature we read kind of it embodies the kind of judgments we make about specific issues, and I think it might become really difficult to limit ourselves in certain ways.
If I may just briefly add to that question. So this is the conversation that we had, and while having that conversation, you will also considering, is there a different sort of value to be extracted when we are, considering rewriting in a specific time period? So the Feminist Judgment Project, they said that they thought that they should write, say rewrite Rukmabai in the period that it was decided, because they thought that there was a certain value to that, because they wanted to show how the judges actually had material at their disposal, and yet it was maybe sort of their biases which did the guiding work, and therefore the judgment came out in a certain way. So that was, I think, the value that they were looking towards. So I was just, so Nidhi's question in a sense assumes that, we are supposed to do that, and therefore how do we, not look at anything, all the developments beyond that point. But the question that I just wanted to supplement is, are we even required? Should we even be doing that? Should we actually, is there a different sort of value to be extracted if we are rewriting judgments in the present context?
It depends on which judgments you pick up, right? Presumably you pick up judgments of the, what I was just mentioning, High Court, Supreme Court, trial courts, army tribunals, etc., then the Constitution is in is a document which you use the constitution, there's no problem using that particular document. If you're thinking of a pre-colonial period, of course, then the question of the constitution becomes not relevant. But then the question still remains, right? I mean, I think it's an interesting challenge. Can you rewrite it with the I assume with the rights protective lens, without the notion of rights being there, right? And give you one example is the March Satyagraha, right? When Ambedkar participated in the March Satyagraha, and he said that the entire question of the injunction, when there's an injunction against, for example, the Dalits taking water from the tank, they didn't challenge that injunction. And Ambedkar's point is that what we want from the court is we want a judgment. Why we want the judgment? We want judgment because the judgment, in a sense, we wanted to say that the custom of untouchability is not just immemorial, is not just for a long period of time, but also against public policy. And it's the time before time. When the constitution is not in place, you get a judgment of the court which says that the practice of untouchability is against public policy. That's a certain kind of normative recognition which you get in terms of the law. So that's what you had to work with at the moment in time, right? So I would imagine it depends on what time period you're looking at, And if you take, for example, I just suddenly remembered that the judgment we do have, and the analysis we do have is Mayur Suresh's article. It's on the Kamla Jan judgment. Kamla Jan, nobody knows the case. I'm saying if you'll find 10 cases like that, nobody knows and write about it. That itself will be fantastic.
Professor Rahul, I think you had something to add as well.
Yeah, so I can see, I'm not actually very familiar with the feminist rewriting project, so I'm just answering this question based on, what are thoughts provoked by this discussion. I can see value in doing both because there are obviously old pre-colonial judgments that are still the law of the land, and there is a value in rewriting those judgments in light of the law as it stands today. They may not have been challenged, but one thing that this project can do is to actually identify problematic judgments that have yet to be challenged, that perhaps need to be rewritten, even if a petitioner has not come forward. But I think there is also an interesting historical and political value in rewriting judgments in light of what was known at the time, regardless of their status as law or not law today. Because what that forces us to do is it forces us to think about the question of what knowledges were hegemonic, what knowledges were subjugated in that particular moment. Some of those knowledges may have been accessible to the judges, but may have been ignored or pushed aside. Other forms of knowledge may not even have been intelligible. So it's a different kind of exercise that requires maybe a different kind of analysis. But I think there's value there as well because it alerts us to the question of power and knowledge and how they're connected in that particular moment. And I think that's a really important diagnostic as much as any other kind of exercise.
I'll also add that as a teacher, I'm often railing to my students against presentism. So the word presentism. And the reason that I do that, and anybody with a kind of historical head would do that, is because when we apply the categorical norms of our current context onto the past, we are usually missing something about what happened in the past. So, for example, there was a lot of excitement in the 80s about queer historians running around trying to find gay ancestors. And they did things like go to cemeteries and see that there were, in France, and see that there's a grave that's marked 1440, and it obviously has two men in the grave. So then a whole story is made about, they were lovers and they were so into each other and they died together and they were buried together. And, this kind of bourgeois present day gay fantasy is ascribed to these people. Now, all we have is the tombstone and two men's names. So yes, we could assume that these were people who were categorized as men in their time. You know, I'm of the view that even mapping binary gender that far back is an act of presentism, but okay, perhaps we can assume that they were men, but we don't know anything about their affective life beyond that. That would read as gay today, but it would be a big mistake to say that that was gay in 1440 when the category of homosexuality did not exist, when the discourse of sexuality itself did not exist. So I think that there is a great benefit of not having presentist perspectives, especially on the late 19th century. So much was going on, so much was being produced of the world that we inhabit. I think another advantage of kind of trying to be contemporaneous within the time that the judgment was written is we get to really understand the circumstances that produce the world that we inhabit, particularly through a project like this. One thing I'll say about the feminist judgment rewriting project and about feminist work in general is that, you know, of course I'm a feminist. Of course I grew up in the women's movement, but one thing that is a fair criticism of the women's movement is the way in which it reifies gender, the way it reifies binary gender, the way, not all of it. There are plenty of us who are queer feminists and trans feminists as well, but there is an aspect of feminism that is very attached to the idea of biological gender, the idea that gender is something that's fixed and that the subject position of women is something particular that needs to be addressed through law, through policy, and that anything that historicizes gender is seen to kind of take away the power of that critique. It's not a critique that I share, but I think it's a perspective that we can have radical compassion for, even if we don't agree with it. So when you do your judgments rewriting, it's my hope that you also adopt a feminist perspective, but perhaps you will adopt a queer feminist or trans feminist perspective when you do that, because it's not untrue that gender norms behave hierarchically, right? We do live in a world that produces gendered hierarchies. The only difference between my saying that and somebody, a feminist who believes in biological gender saying that, is I think that these hierarchies are iterated over time, that when laws on women are being written, they are also writing women. They are also producing women in that. We're not just describing something, it's something that's actually much deeper. So my plea to you is please don't not be feminists when you do your work.
Thank you, Professor. I don't think we have more questions from anyone right now, but if the three of you wish to add anything, please do. But thanks for coming in, and it was a really wonderful session. And if anybody else wants to say anything, please do. No.
Thank you so much. This was fantastic. Thank you to Rahul and Arvind and Sarthak and all of you for hanging in there till 9 o'clock. It was really lovely to talk to you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks from me too. Thanks for the invitation. And yeah, it was great to be in conversation with you, Swati and Arvind also. I wish I was there in person, but soon, hopefully.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much, Professor.
Thank you.
We'll end the meeting. Yeah. Bye-bye.